Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into something kind of different this time?
Different indeed.
We're going to well, it's like this. You know how the Bible mentions certain books, right? But then you go looking for them and they're, well, not there.
Ah, you're talking about those texts that didn't quite make it into the official canon, the ones left out of the final cut.
Exactly. It's like finding out your favorite movie had a whole secret storyline that got left on the cutting room floor. We're talking banned from the Bible. That's our source material, by the way. Books banned, rejected, and forbidden. It's by Joseph B. Lumpkin.
Intriguing title. So we're diving into the world of lost scriptures, those texts that were circulating but ultimately excluded from the Bible as we know it.
Yeah, and Lumpkin makes an interesting point. He says getting deeper into scripture often leads to more questions, like beyond the Bible itself.
It's true. Studying the Bible can be like peeling back layers of an onion. Each answer reveals more questions, pushing us to seek a broader understanding.
It's like those old maps with "Here be dragons" written in the margins. It makes you want to explore those uncharted territories.
Indeed. It's crucial to remember that establishing the biblical canon wasn't some sudden event, It took centuries. Different groups, different times, they all had their own ideas about which texts were divinely inspired, historically accurate, were simply important enough to include.
Right, and early on, those first Christians, they sort of looked to the Jewish traditions of understanding the Old Testament as a starting point, which makes sense, but
Of course, of course. But as Christianity spread to Gentile communities, those folks who weren't Jewish, they brought their own interpretations of those scriptures to the table. This naturally led to some lively discussions about which books truly belonged in the Bible.
lively is one way to put it. I mean, can you imagine those debates? But, here's something that blows my mind. Even those books that didn't become part of the official canon, they can still teach us a lot, right?
Absolutely. Think of it like archaeology. Sometimes the most fascinating discoveries are those fragments, those seemingly insignificant pieces that, when pieced together, can illuminate a forgotten culture, a lost way of life.
It's like finding a box of old letters in the attic. They might not rewrite history, but they give you a whole new perspective on it.
Precisely. These excluded texts offer a window into the diverse beliefs and practices of early Christianity. They show us the range of ideas circulating back then, the theological conversations people were having.
Oh, and speaking of amazing discoveries, we got to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Talk about stumbling upon a treasure trove of biblical history.
Ah, yes, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, those are incredible. Dated back to the 2nd century BC, even before the canon was settled. They show us a time when a much wider array of texts were considered influential within those early Jewish communities.
It's like getting a sneak peek into the library of those who lived during biblical times.
Precisely. And what's remarkable is that they found fragments from every single Old Testament book we know today, plus a whole bunch of others. Texts that didn't make the final cut, but were clearly important to those communities.
So how do we know these excluded books were still on people's minds back then? If they weren't in the official Bible, how do we even know they were still in the conversation?
Well, Lumpkin points out a few key things. Sometimes these texts are directly mentioned by name in the Bible. Other times they're clearly used as a source, their ideas woven into the fabric of the biblical narrative, and in some cases they're even quoted directly.
Like the book of Jasher,
Right.
mentioned in both Joshua and 2 Samuel. It's not just some obscure text, it's directly referenced. And here's where it gets really interesting, right? Because there are versions of the book of Joshua floating around today.
Fascinating, isn't it? Like finding a living link to that ancient world.
It's like a direct line to those biblical times. So we're talking about actual texts, not just whispers and rumors. And that leads us to one of the most intriguing banned books of all, the Book of Enoch. Lumpkin really emphasizes how this particular book, especially the Ethiopian version, really made an impact on the New Testament writers.
The Ethiopian version being the most complete one we have today, though there's also the Slavonic version, considered a bit less reliable perhaps. But the impact of Enoch on the New Testament is undeniable.
He even says it's more influential on the New Testament than the Old Testament. Now, to be fair to Lumpkin, he's not here to argue whether we should all believe everything in the Book of Enoch. He's just laying out the facts, right?
Precisely. He's presenting the evidence and allowing the reader to draw their own conclusions. But the evidence of Enoch's influence is compelling, to say the least.
It certainly is. Especially when you consider that the Book of Enoch was treasured by both Jewish and early Christian communities. And get this, it's still read in Coptic Christian churches in Ethiopia, maybe even the version you've heard about.
It's quite possible. The Ethiopian text is considered the most complete and likely the one most familiar to those who've encountered Enoch.
And it has quite a history, right?
Oh, absolutely. Scholars believe it was written sometime around the 2nd century BC. But like a lot of ancient texts, its roots probably go back even further to oral traditions passed down over generations. Just imagine those stories, those teachings passed down through centuries. And it was incredibly popular among various Jewish groups for over 500 years.
That's amazing. So how do we go from those ancient traditions to the book we have in our hands today? Tell me there's a good story there.
Oh, there's always a story. The oldest actual copy we have of Enoch is from the 1st century BC. And here's the thing, it was translated from Greek. And get this, that Greek version was itself a copy of an even older text, probably written in Aramaic. It's like a game of telephone across centuries.
Talk about a long game of telephone, so many layers of history, of translation, of interpretation. And get this, when the Book of Enoch was rediscovered by scholars back in the 18th century, they actually thought it was written after Christianity started because it had so much in common with the New Testament.
It's remarkable, isn't it? How our understanding of history can be so dramatically reshaped by new discoveries. In this case, those Qumran discoveries, those Dead Sea Scrolls, completely changed the game.
Talk about a plot twist. It's like those scrolls were just waiting to rewrite history. Finding them made it crystal clear that the Book of Enoch predated Christianity. And not only that, but it had a huge influence on those early Christian thinkers.
Absolutely. It's a prime example of how archaeology can completely upend our preconceived notions and shed new light on our understanding of the past. It makes you wonder what other secrets are still buried out there, just waiting to be unearthed.
Right. It makes you wonder what else we might have gotten wrong. But I'm curious, what exactly makes the Book of Enoch's influence so undeniable? What are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, the thematic connections are pretty hard to miss. Enoch talks about a coming kingdom, angels, judgment, all these things that are central to Jesus' teachings. It really makes you wonder if Jesus himself might have studied this book. Makes you think, right, what else is out there? What other books, what other stories? I mean, Enoch's not the only one, is it?
Not even Lunkins' book, it's like a whole list, things like the Chronicles of David, the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite. Oh, the records of Nathan the prophet, even a treatise of the prophet Iddo.
Names lost to time, practically. Imagine those texts resurfacing. It'd be like finding a whole other section of a library at Alexandria.
It really makes you think, what kind of stuff was in those books? What stories did they tell? What perspectives did they offer?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's like having a giant puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Exactly. It's frustrating. But then, it also makes you wonder, what if those pieces were removed on purpose?
Oh, now you're getting to the heart of it. What if those missing pieces were deliberately left out to shape a certain narrative, to promote certain interpretations?
That's a thought, right? Whose version of history are we left with? Whose voices were silenced?
And that brings up a really crucial question, doesn't it? Why were these specific books excluded? What made them so controversial?
Each one probably has its own story, but if you look closely at Lumpkin's book, you start to see some recurring themes. It's like, these are the reasons why a book gets banned, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the big ones, theological differences. Remember, those early communities, they were constantly debating which texts were truly divinely inspired. Well, those debates often centered on core beliefs about God, Jesus, salvation.
So if a book presented a different take on those core beliefs, challenged the accepted dogma,
I was going to ruffle some feathers, to say the least.
makes you think about who has the power to decide what's right. Whose version of faith gets to be the official one.
Exactly. And it wasn't always just about theological disagreements either. Sometimes a book's historical accuracy would be called into question.
Like with Enoch, the whole 70 generations thing.
Precisely. If a book's claims couldn't be reconciled with the accepted historical narrative, or if the stories seemed too fantastical.
Too hard to swallow.
Exactly. Well, that could raise serious doubts about the book's authenticity.
So it's like this balancing act. Trying to stay true to certain theological ideas while also staying within the bounds of what's considered historically plausible?
In a way, yes. But there's another really important factor to consider, and that's the cultural context. The world in which these books were written, it was a very different place. What might have been totally acceptable back then.
Could raise eyebrows today, to put it mildly.
It's like looking back at old photos and cringing.
Exactly. As societal norms changed, some of the things found in these excluded books might have seemed out of touch, even offensive, to those shaping the biblical canon.
So we've got theological debates, historical questions, and evolving cultural norms. It's no wonder some of these books got left behind. And remember, canon formation wasn't some cold, objective process. There were power dynamics at play, political agendas, personal biases, who had influence, who wanted to promote which ideas. All of that factored into the equation.
Right. It's easy to think of the Bible as this, I don't know, this untouchable, unchanging thing, but it really is a product of human choices and interpretations.
It is, and that's exactly why engaging with these excluded books is so important. They remind us of the diversity of early Christian thought, the variety of beliefs and interpretations that existed. It wasn't a monolithic movement, that's for sure.
It's like history isn't just one straight line, right? It's messy. There are always different sides to the story.
Absolutely. And by exploring these excluded texts, we get a more nuanced understanding of how the Bible came to be.
Which is fascinating from a historical perspective. But I think people listening might be wondering, what does this have to do with me? Why should I care about these excluded books today?
That's a fair question.
Mm.
I think, for me, it's about broadening our understanding of the Bible and its context. These books, they give us a window into the richness and diversity of early Christian thought. It's like, you know how people talk about finding those missing links in evolution?
Yeah.
This is kind of like that. We're getting a fuller picture of how those early Christian communities understood their faith.
I like that. It's about acknowledging that there were different voices, different perspectives, even if they didn't all make it into the official canon.
Exactly. By engaging with these excluded texts, I think we develop a deeper appreciation for the complexity of biblical history. We see the human element at play, and that can be a really powerful thing.
It's like sometimes, you can learn more from the things that are left out than the things that are included.
Oh, I like that. It's like that feeling of excitement when you discover a hidden room in an old house.
Yeah.
You have no idea what treasures you might find.
Right.
These texts, they challenge us to approach the Bible with fresh eyes, with open minds. They invite us to ask new questions, to consider interpretations we may not have encountered before.
It's like realizing your faith journey doesn't have to fit in a box. There are all these different paths you can take.
That's a great way to put it. And, it's fascinating to think that for those early Christians, there wasn't this one, official Bible that everyone agreed on from the get-go. Lumpkin really emphasizes that point. It was a lot more, I don't know, fluid back then, open to interpretation.
See, it wasn't like a light switch, on, off, these books, yes, these books, no.
Not at all. Different communities, they had their own favorite texts, right? Their own ideas about what was truly sacred, truly authoritative. It was an ongoing conversation, a process of discernment.
And some groups, like those Coptic Christians we talked about in Ethiopia, they held on to certain books, like Enoch, long after others moved on. And they still consider it part of their Bible today, right?
Absolutely. It's a testament to the diversity of beliefs within Christianity, even from the very beginning.
Which makes you wonder, though, about who gets to make the final call. If people had different opinions on which books were truly sacred, who gets to decide which ones make it in and which ones are left out?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that's still being debated today. Who has the ultimate authority to define what we call Scripture? Is it a matter of individual belief, communal consensus? There are no easy answers.
It's humbling, in a way. Even those texts we consider sacred, they have a history, a context.
Absolutely. And that's what makes studying these excluded books so enriching, so valuable. It helps us appreciate the complexity of biblical history. We get to see how different communities wrestled with these same questions of faith and authority.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these, let's call them the banned books of the Bible, what's the takeaway for our listeners? Why should they care about these texts that didn't quite make the cut?
Well, for starters, it's just a fascinating journey. These books give us a glimpse into the lives, the beliefs of those early followers of Jesus. And they wrestled with some of the same questions we're still asking today. It helps us connect with the human side of religious history.
Like finding a box of old letters in the attic, it gives you a whole new perspective on your own family history,
Exactly. But beyond just the historical intrigue, I think these excluded books challenge us to think critically about the Bible. They remind us that the Bible we have today, it didn't just appear out of thin air. It went through a long and complex process of selection and interpretation.
It's like realizing that your favorite movie, it went through countless rewrites, edits, what we see on screen. It's not the whole story.
Right. And understanding that process, that there were choices made, different voices, I think it can deepen our appreciation for the texts themselves. It allows us to engage with them in a more thoughtful, more informed way.
So it's not about tossing out the Bible, but about understanding it better, understanding where it came from.
Exactly. These excluded books, they can even inspire us in our own spiritual journeys. They encourage us to ask new questions, explore new perspectives, and maybe even deepen our connection to this incredibly rich and diverse Christian tradition.
It's about approaching our faith with curiosity, with an open mind and an open heart. And maybe even a little bit of, I don't know, a little bit of adventure. There's a whole world of hidden treasures out there just waiting to be discovered. So keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, keep the conversation going. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.